Well, seeing as how it's almost Halloween, it just seemed like the perfect time of year to tell this next tale. First of all, how many of you grew up here in Westford? Nobody grew up here? Okay, well then I can just say anything I want. This story, if you grew up here in the 50s and 60s, you might have already heard about the Howard house, which it's not there anymore. It was torn down in the 1960s. But for more than 100 years before that, it just sat there out on the end of Howard Road in Forge Village. And it was an old farmhouse. And it had two fireplaces, one on either side of the house. And so the chimneys stuck up through the roof like devil's horns. And it was surrounded by cornfields. And there were pheasants hiding in the cornfields. And at night, those pheasants would make a racket like bloody murder. And it was a creepy old house, and everybody knew it was haunted, which is probably why it stood abandoned so long after Alice Howard died in 1952. Alice was the last of the Howard clan to live in the old homestead. And when she was younger, she'd gone off to Simmons College and got herself a library degree, and everybody thought she'd just go off to the big city and get a job. But instead, she came back home to help her brother John on the farm. Big mistake for Alice. I mean, John was a good farmer, but he had a temper. And he used to ride his brother and sister something awful. He wouldn't let any of them leave the farm. He said it's a family business, and it takes the whole family to make it run. Some people say he tricked Alice into coming home, and then he just gradually stole her future away. Anyway, it was John's brother Thomas who found him dead in the field that frosty fall morning. It looked like he'd been run over by his own plow. It wasn't much of an improvement because Thomas was just as bad as John was. I mean, they had two other sisters. One of them got a job in Boston and moved away. The other one got married and she moved away too. But Thomas never let Alice go anywhere. And a lot of folks talked about that. And a rumor started going around that maybe John's death wasn't an accident after all. That maybe his brother killed him, and Alice either knew about it or watched it happen. But the law could never really prove anything, so life just kept on going on. And Thomas died a few years after that. That was another kind of a freak accident. You see, he was in the barn, and he must have tripped and stumbled or something because he cracked his head wide open. And there was blood everywhere. It was an awful sight. But what got everybody talking was the tattoo he had across his forehead. It was a pig tattoo. And I don't mean it was a picture of a pig. I mean it's the kind of tattoo that farmers use to identify which pigs are theirs. It's kind of like a brand, only it uses ink instead of hot iron. And see what it is, you've got this long-handled tool called a striker. And the striker has a steel plate on the end, and there are pins in that plate. And you can rearrange those pins so that the tattoo can spell out almost anything you want it to. And usually it's a serial number that identifies the pig and where it came from. But you can make it say whatever you want to. And then I guess the way it works is you just dip the pins in ink, and then you whack the striker against the shoulder of the pig, and it makes a nice, clear tattoo. Well, Thomas must have been fiddling around with this striker the night he died, because instead of spelling out the serial number of the farm and all, it had the date on it. It said OCT 261936. Now, that got people to talking in town something fierce. I mean, it's almighty unusual for a guy to die with the date of his death tattooed across the forehead like that. They figured what he must have done after he put the date on it, he hung it up on the rack above the the workbench there, and then when he fell, he must have hit the workbench, and it came down and whacked him right across the forehead. Anyway, folks kind of expected Alice to sell the farm and move away at that point, but she didn't. She held on to that farm right up until the day she died. And folks said she went a little bit crazy living all the way out there all by herself. She barely left the house after that. Anyway, it wasn't too long after Alice died that a young man by the name of Stuart Granger tried to spend the night in the old Howard house. Anybody remember Stuart? No? So I guess if I tried to tell you he's got a statue of him on the common. Okay, that one's not going to fly. We'll just forget about that one. There's no statue. Well, see, he did it on a dare. And what he did is he climbed in a window that was broken around the back of the house. He didn't say how this window was broken, whether it was broken before he got there or maybe he did it, but we're not going to hold him for that just at the moment. Anyway, he snuck into this house, and he said there were books all over the place, wall to wall and floor to ceiling, and they were all neatly arranged by Dewey Decimal Classification System. And they even had date due slips in the back of the book on the inside back cover. Anyway, about 9 o'clock that evening, Stuart was in the kitchen fixing himself a sandwich when he saw the ghost of Alice Howard come through the door that led out towards the barn. And she was wearing this long flowing nightgown kind of thing that was white with red stains over the front. And she had this long-handled tool in her hand, and as she floated closer to Stuart, she raised up the striker, grinned at him, and said, "Are you ready to check out, my dear?" Well, he bolted out of that house so fast he left his sandwich sitting there on the kitchen table. And if you went up to that house even years after that and were brave enough to peek in the window, you would have seen that sandwich still sitting on the kitchen table untouched. And if any of you are doubting whether this story is true or not, well, just ask the folks here at the Westford Museum. I'm sure they can set you straight. Thank you.